A man was reading a poem out loud on the subway. He was reading it from a book held in his hand while leaning against a pole. He was probably reading it in Spanish. The poem was a short one, since he only stood there for a while. A bag placed on the ground in front of him was slightly trembling with the wavering train car. The quietness of that moment enabled me to hear what was coming out of his mouth. A peculiar reason, split by brief phrases and long pauses, as if from a relentless poem-reading machine. But it all suddenly ended, as a man closed his book, bent his body, and picked up his bag. There was no eye contact during the process. There was no waiting for something else. The car was still humming in silence. After a few seconds, the door opened, and the man stepped out of the car. Nothing seems to be left behind by him, but was there something in the air? I was awed by the scene. I've seen a lot of street artists performing on the NYC subway. Most of them sing or dance, filling the subway cars with joyful melodies. But this was the first time that I saw someone whose performance on the subway was literally reading out loud a poem. What he did was so light that nothing seems to have happened, but something in the air had mesmerized me. Why would someone choose to read a poem as a street performance on the subway? It took me for a while to realize that I didn't really understand any Spanish, which means what that man was reading was probably not a poem. My recollection of a subway performance is fictional because my understanding of that performer's language is fictional, and I would never have the opportunity to figure out what he was genuinely reading at that moment because I forgot to record it. That moment has, therefore, slipped away forever. What was left in his reading was only my reading. It was the I who read something from that man, from the interlinear of his words, from the specific spot he was standing on the ground, into something that resembled to me a hint of poetry. So the question becomes for myself, why would I have read something random into something poetic? Why was that trivial moment of a poem reading performance memorable and important to me? Was it beautiful or cruel that I receive a poem from a strange place like the NYC subway? What's more in the air? I have experienced that similar quietness before. The first day I walked into a subway car in New York, I found myself in a performance of a veteran. He was giving a solo lecture. I wasn't able to fully understand what he was saying, but could remember it was something about his monthly salary. His voice was calm, and the audience were even calmer. That was a version of calmness, fused with a contained bewilderment and thundering silence, which I was only able to figure out and join in after seeing more subway lectures. But at the end of that specific performance, that veteran went on to say, "I hope you all have a nice day." His tone invoked a homeless man I met almost every morning in the street corner of my dormitory building, who greeted every passerby with the same phrase in the same sluggishness. I have since quoted them every time when saying the line, "Have a nice day," to end a performance of daily English conversation. This is an embodied line of greeting that I learned beyond ending chapter 1 of an English textbook, but from someone under the ground, along with his earthly tone and affect. What's more in the air? I came to New York as an international student from China to study anthropology for graduate school during the COVID, and I didn't dare to take the subway in my first 2 months here because 2 Asian women were pushed off a platform in a row. The subway intimidated me too much. In fact, almost everything intimidated me in that time for reminding the strangeness of mine, as a foreigner, a nobody. But as a nobody, my body somehow becomes more prominent for me, since I can now feel its every tremor regarding an existential crisis. Am I gonna die on the subway today? Luckily, I survived. But I did have been close to death in the subway. The death not of myself, but feels like myself. The death of somebody else, not as a private event, but affecting the subway as a whole. One time on my way to school, the train suddenly stopped because someone had fell off the platform. All passengers were asked to leave immediately and transfer to bus. In a minute, I was swept off the train by the crowds out of the subway station. It was Times Square, 42nd Street. A haze of people was walking to the bus stop and Bryant Park, and I found myself following them. I don't know how to verbalize what was on my mind or feet. I was probably at once petrified and moving on, as I had to hurry for school. I should have kept a diary that day, and yes, I found it on my phone memo with my fragmented language. Yet it reminded me more of what hadn't been written down. That beautiful sunny day, that road to Bryant Park crowded with tourists, an old sir smiling at me in a warm gaze at the bus stop. He probably saw my tears and asked me in a greeting tone, "The bus is not coming?" The news of the deaths came out while we were waiting for the bus. A 22-year-old killed himself at the Lincoln Center Street station a few minutes ago. A suicide, not a murder. A death in a plan, not an accident. But that he chose to fall to his death off the platform become an accident in its etymology, as to have a fall, whose ground becomes the death. I was still staring vacantly at my phone when feeling a breeze blowing by, with the glittering green in the tree and the warmth in the sunlight. The saxophone music from the park, the pigeons busy on the ground, pecking and flapping. Something in the air blew me away as I felt myself surrounded by the world in nearly its most beautiful moment. A moment that is almost golden, almost a circumstance of life, almost a welcome to the world, yet immediately after an event of death. I was confused. What's more in the air? Now right in front of my eyes, a subway aide writes, "Don't be someone else's subway story. Courtesy counts." Directly below it echoes another one. "A free and open society is where we have the right to privacy." A silent vibration between the words privacy and courtesy stands out to me. By reading them together, I was refreshed with my confusion of naming a performance from a stranger as a poem. As if I have already acquainted with the courtesy of a poem, to be able to say that I know what it is. No, I didn't. It seems clear now that the only thing I know for sure about that moment is my question mark of it. I wasn't able to understand anything. Neither his words nor his act. I was messed up. Something messed me up in his words that were placed in the subway space, and reminded me of the first day I took the NYC subway. That veteran performance I randomly walked into. That homeless sitting on the ground. That death. Something in his words messed up the relationship I thought my body had established with the subway. If there was something felt as poetry happened in that man's words, it was not something as the crown of the literature, but the ground. It was so below, trivial, and down to earth, almost like the way that man, leaning against that poem, his body trembling with the train, the mud on his back. From his speech came a sense of poetry, in its shallowest form of brokenness, that was somehow best received by me as a broken reader, a non-properly constituted subject of speech in English, who read a poem not by understanding it, but by not understanding it, and thus forever reading it, and forever not understanding it. What's more in the air? That poem is in motion, and I'm sitting across in motion with it too. It is in the motion of the subway car that I realize I'm riding through the edge of the anthropological field. Anthropologists' most classic theorization of subway is the non-place. They are space of transience without solid social relations, and don't hold enough significance to be considered as a place. If an anthropological field is a body of texts, and doing ethnography is a process of reading and translating them, the subway is the unreadable and untranslatable enigma. Passenger is not an effective social identity, but an assemblage of nobodies whose identities disappear when subway door cracks open. What happened inside will always escape the frame of the phenomenon to become the ephemeral, a performance that cannot be decoded. It is something in the air. But how to read something in the air? How to read something that is always in motion? How to read the unreadable subway by doing things with it? Is there anything shared behind every single passenger's experience of the subway that is moving across and connecting between? I was reminded of that poem which makes me disorientated between the beginning and end of performance. That poem which wasn't brought in and taken by that specific performer. That poem which felt my knowledge of poetry and language, which I would never be able to figure out whether it was a real poem or not. Yet I receive it as a poem. It was already there in the air, as if that poem reader was already among the passengers in that train car. I didn't understand and still could not comprehend that poem in my head. Yet I remember it by heart, through the so many moments of breakdown it had evoked for me about the subway. As a nobody, that poems allowed me to conduct an ethnographic reading of myself as an other by placing it in the subway, in the middle of the rest of my others. By seeing myself in the subway, I see others too, those intimate moments of bewilderment and breakdown in myself, which had thus become my privacy, are when I randomly walk into the performances of others, possessed by their intimate moments of breakdown, which had become their privacy. My disorientation in those moments, between the beginning and end of a performance, is also my disorientation in whether that performance comes from the I or the other. This is what that poem, grounded on the material condition of the subway, has taught me to read and see. It is a seeing of a blurred performance, a shared privacy, and an interrelated subjectivity between the I and the other. The scene of a blurred performance evoked by that poem is also a scene of the social, which comes from seeing the capacity of myself being affected by others, that constitutes the very condition of being myself. That poem told me to see that I was already among the passengers on the subway. Just like that poem reader, this is an affective sociality that starts from the blurring of his performance and mine, registered by the subway's materiality of space and time, which is not an effective but an affective one, like the texture of a poem.